a context of why Oxfam is here in this conference this morning, we have our country director for Oxfam Great Britain in the Philippines, Ms. Lan Mercado.
Thank you, Luz. Ay, sorry. Why did I call you Luz? Thanks, Carla. First of all, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for staying for this panel organized by Oxfam on women, food security, and climate change. I'm not going to give a formal address. Instead, I'll probably just put Oxfam's work on climate change and women's livelihoods in a little bit of a context, both from a global perspective, but also from the perspective that we have of our work here in the Philippines. For those who are seeing Oxfam and meeting us for the first time, Oxfam has actually been in existence for many decades now. Oxfam International is a group of 13 affiliates all over the world, based in many countries, the most recent addition being Oxfam India. We work on sustainable development, focusing largely on livelihoods. We also do a lot of humanitarian response and emergency preparedness, again, in many places all over the world, working directly with vulnerable people. And of late, we have also assumed the role of campaigning and advocacy, because Oxfam has realized that the work on the ground with communities and with partners amongst civil society and even government cannot really proceed sustainably without changing the policy environment, particularly the global policy environment. In the Philippines, Oxfam has been working for 20 years now and counting, and again also focusing on these three major areas: sustainable development, humanitarian preparedness and response, and advocacy and campaigning. Since 2 years ago, we have started to focus our efforts more on Mindanao, because that is where a lot of the issues, as far as Oxfam's perspective goes, has been intersecting. Across these three focus areas for us, one of the major emphasis that we have been really trying to highlight is the role of women, both in sustainable development but also in humanitarian situations. I think we also need to say a little bit about how these two areas of work for Oxfam has intertwined much more closely ever since we started noticing the impact of climate change, not only on the frequency and the dynamics of disasters that have been happening, but also how the dynamics of natural disasters have had implications on the livelihoods of poor people. And of course, because women are the most vulnerable, beginning with their invisibility from analysis to program to policy interventions, they have also been bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change. Having realized this, Oxfam has mounted a number of efforts to try and address the situation, both from developing our own understanding of how these different strands intersect, but also perhaps more importantly, sharing and that analysis and enriching it even further by working alongside partners, most primarily our partners amongst vulnerable communities themselves, and most specifically with women rural producers who are really rendered vulnerable by these developments. Over the past few weeks, we started a series of activities that we would like to use to highlight the situation. On October 14, we launched a RISE paper that talks about why the Philippines continues to be vulnerable to the vagaries of the world market as far as a fundamental staple is concerned. We followed that with a launch of our global paper on double-edged prices, which also talks about why the high level of prices of food commodities have actually not benefited even producers themselves. And we'd like to conclude this series of activities with this panel. And so I think what's been obvious to me is also how we've tried to expand the audience and the circle of people that we are trying to reach out to and develop a network and explore possible partnerships around these issues. The challenges are huge, obviously, ahead of us. And we've often been asked over these past few weeks about the extent of the problem. And while that is important, I think it's also equally important to really focus on solutions, to really focus on what can be done. Because at the end of the day, I think there's a lot more energy around that. And even as we speak, women in Mindanao, as in many other vulnerable provinces, are already doing something about the situation. And I think that needs to be acknowledged as well, that at the center of all this are the women producers who are trying to cope and only need to receive the attention and additional support. So hopefully, with activities like this, we will be bringing a lot more attention and energy around their own efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Lan. To start, again, let me formally introduce to you our panel for this morning, our speakers. As what Lan had said, we wanted really to invite people who can really share, or our panel will be presenting really current initiatives and good practices by women themselves, on what they do in sustainable livelihoods, how they achieve food security, and also adapting to climate change impacts. We have a very interesting panel who've been involved with women in sustainable livelihoods for quite a long time. Our first speaker to talk about the global food crisis is Dr. Ines Smith, who is the Global Gender Advisor of Oxfam. She has worked for 1 year for the ADB here in the Philippines, so she's very familiar with this country. She will do a presentation for 15 minutes. After which, our next speaker will talk about women in agriculture. Daryl Layesa, is the coordinator of the Rural Women's Center of Centro Saca Incorporated, which is a research and advocacy institution for rural women. And she served for the past, I think, 3 years as the Secretary General of the National Rural Women Coalition. That's in English. In Tagalog, it's called PKKK. Okay, Pambansang Kongreso ng Kababaihan sa Kanayunan. Okay. And our last speaker is Marita Rodriguez, who is the Program Development Officer of the Center for Empowerment and Research Development, or CERD. This is an NGO in the Philippines involved in community-based resource management programs, and they actually pioneered quite a lot of work among rural women in fisheries. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, to start, for the first 15 minutes, Dr. Ines Smith.
I shall descend. We spent the last 2 days staring at each other across great distances. Can I ask you, has anybody noticed that food prices have increased? I mean, in your own personal life? You've noticed that. What have you done about it? What have you done individually? Can I just hear a couple of examples? Complain, good start. Cut down your expenditure. Anybody else? Another example. You cut down on expenditure. No, buy less. Home gardens, growing your own food. Anybody else?
Traditional crops, fishing.
Come back to your traditional crops.